Hey guys, welcome to my second tutorial. In my first tutorial, you saw that we built based on the Blender Guru 2.8 donut tutorial to basically fix the intersecting sprinkles problem and also make the icing material a little bit nicer, at least in my opinion. But one of the things I finished with in that video was I wanted to experiment with getting the sprinkles to look like they're truly embedded in the icing. And as you can see from this render, I think that I accomplished that. So today, I'm going to show you how to do this. Now, this will probably be my last tutorial related to donuts. I don't want to completely try to leverage Blender Guru's donut tutorial series. However, these are things that I see come up on Reddit often, especially the sprinkles intersecting issue. And just as a stretch goal, I decided to tackle this. Now, I do have a completely original tutorial coming up in the next few days, so make sure to keep an eye out for that, subscribe and all that stuff. But without further ado, let's talk about how I managed to make it look like they were embedded into the icing. So I have some reference images here, and there's a couple things to look for when you're seeing the effect that we're trying to create. In some cases, like this green one right here, you can see that it's embedded and it seems to have like a little gap, a little air gap around it. Whereas other times they seem like they're embedded, but the frosting kind of, creeped up the edges, as it thinned out like a meniscus on like a beverage or something. And so we're going to recreate those effects. And what probably happens is over time, the frosting is wet, but then as it dries out, it contracts and it will separate itself from the sprinkle, creating that gap around the edge. So we're going to go more for that gap look, like it's been sitting out for a couple hours instead of fresh out of the oven. And then you can see the same thing here. We looked at this image last time as well, and you can see like it almost looks raised around the sprinkle, but then there's a definite gap. So it's like, it goes up, but then breaks off. And leaves like a gap around the sprinkle. Some of them are completely engulfed still, but most of these sprinkles look like they, there's a gap forming around them, but the edges still seem raised. So, how are we going to accomplish that? You can see I kind of have that same thing here, where the edges kind of raise up, but then they also have like a gap around it, where the sprinkle is embedded in there. So, we're going to use a process known as AO baking. AO stands for ambient occlusion. If you don't know what ambient occlusion is, basically think of it like this. If you had perfect lighting, where every single angle of the model received exactly perfect lighting, just due to the nature of the model itself, some things will always be darker, because there's just no way they can receive as much light as other surfaces. And so this is used, usually you bake AO, especially if you're moving your 3D model into a game engine, where you want to have realistic shading, and you can just bake that into your textures. Although these days you can do AO in real time, it still takes a little bit of GPU, but without talking too much about it, we're just going to take advantage of it here, and you'll see how it's useful. So we're going to select our icing. Actually, we're going to turn off everything except for our icing and sprinkles, and we're going to do it in two places. So I'm going to go up to this little filter menu, and on my restriction toggles I'm also going to add the render, and we want to turn off and hide the camera and light, the environment from both the viewport as well as render. The donut collection will leave on, all dem sprinkles will leave on, but the donut itself we're going to hide, and the icing will leave on. Everything else, we can just even uncheck those two collections. And by the way, this takes place after my previous tutorial. If you're coming here straight from Blender Guru, you won't have this all dem sprinkles because they'll still be part of your particle system. It should work with the particle system, so don't worry if your scene looks a little bit different. But this is starting from the place where I left off in the previous tutorial I did. And I'll put that link in the description and put a card if I can. All right, so just these two. We're going to go back to the UV editing workflow. And the first thing we want to do is UV unwrap this. And like Blender Guru pointed out, the clipping is annoying, so we'll hit N. And we will go to, I should turn on, okay, I have screencast keys on. In the view, we will make the clipping smaller so we can see everything. Press N to hide that. And if you were following along with the Blender Guru tutorial, he had us add a crease around the bottom edge of the donut to make the frosting a little bit tighter, hugging the cake donut. And when we did, it added this pink line. So I'm going to go into Edges mode by pressing 2. And I don't know why the screencast keys aren't showing up. They're checked on. There we go. So now it's working. And I'm going to hold Alt and click, and we want to select all the way around this edge. But it won't get it in one go. So for example, I'm actually just going to switch back to vertices. It's a little bit easier to see by pressing 1. So it stopped right here. And the reason why it stopped right there, I'm going to press 5 to get out of perspective mode, is because it's going along, it's going along, and then it comes to a place where it has a pole. So it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different edges connected to this one vertice. So it doesn't know if it should keep going this way or keep going this way. This is why you tend to always use quads, and you tend to always avoid poles, because it makes it harder for the computer to understand certain things. But for now, we're just going to hold Shift and Alt and keep going. It ran into another problem here, only 3 edges instead of 4. But that'll happen a few more times, and your mileage will vary depending on how many drops you did. You'll have a different situation. And also, like I said, if you don't have the pink line, don't worry. You can just pick any series of edges. Going to undo that. There we go. Edges around the model, and you'll be fine. So as long as it's one continuous loop, that's what we want. And we stopped there. Keep going. Select this one. And by the way, when I'm selecting these edge loops, I'm holding Alt and Shift, and I'm clicking on the edge, not on the vertice. And so that way it knows which direction I want to go. I think we're almost done here. Yep, so that's where we started, and you can see we only have a few more segments to go. All right, so now we've selected the ring all the way around the outside of the icing, but don't forget there's also this inside ring, and in my case, I could do it all in one go. But if you have any more severe drips, it might take you a couple tries. Now, we'll just push 2 to go back to edge mode, and we have both of those loops selected. And if we hit Control E, we can say Mark Seam, or we could go up to Edge and say Mark Seam. And when we click that, you can see now that they're red. And a seam is basically used for UV unwrapping. Think of it as if this was made out of 2 pieces of cloth. This is where they would be sewn together along the seams. So right now, this doesn't have any UV coordinates. It does, but it just has the ones that were generated when we started with the torus or whatever. So what I'm going to do is just hit Unwrap. So with this object selected in 3D view, I'm going to press U, or you can go up to UV and choose Unwrap. And this will take a few seconds because there are a lot of faces and it has to do some math. But what we should end up with is 2 circles for the donut down here, and one of them will be for the top side of the icing, and one of them will be for the bottom side of the icing. So the top side of the icing is the part that has all the sprinkles, and the bottom side of the icing is the part that meets the cake donut, so the underside of the icing. But we'll just let this take its time, and I'm going to pause, and hopefully when I unpause, it'll be done. All right, and so now we have the UV unwrapping here. You can see it's a very dense mesh, so when you zoom out, it's almost all black. But we do have all of the faces for the top side and for the bottom side laid out neatly in 2D space. So now we're going to create a new image, and we will call this Icing AO for ambient occlusion, and then 2K, because we will use 2048 and 2048 for the size. And then we'll hit OK. So now we have this black image that's not doing anything. We're going to go back into the shading tab with the icing still selected. If we look at our materials, we're in icing. And what we're going to do is create a new texture node for an image texture. But we're not going to load this texture from the disk. Instead, we're just going to choose that texture, the blank one we just made. So Icing AO2K. Click on that. Click on this box and make sure that this is selected. And we'll quickly switch our image to be that black image so we know what's happening. And now we have to bake this. So when we go into render settings, we should be using cycles. I'm going to be using CPU because I think it interferes with my graphics card less when I'm recording videos. Normally, I would be using GPU because it's faster. But for baking AO, we don't really need that many samples. It's going to be black and white, and it's a relatively straightforward process. So for now, normally I would render like this final image with 512 samples. But for this, we're only going to use, let's say, 32. All right, and then we expand this bake panel down here in render settings. And we want to change the bake type to be ambient occlusion. Okay, so just to make sure that you're on the same page as me, we have the icing selected. Inside the icing, we have the icing texture selected. This node is lit up because it's selected. And it is set to our blank image that we just created. So this is selected. We only have 32 samples to render. And we set bake to ambient occlusion, and we hit bake. So you'll see this little texture bake progress bar down at the bottom. And this is basically doing like a render like you would for an image. But instead of rendering to like a camera image, it's instead rendering to a texture, to the surface of the object, basically. So we will see once this render completes. There we go. So this is an ambient occlusion map. And basically, you see that it's black where the sprinkles are because they're intersecting the icing. So no light will ever touch the icing where the sprinkles are. But then near the sprinkles, they kind of cast shadows, because they don't let as much light get near them. So, and you'll see in places where there's a lot of sprinkles, there's more shadow because they let less light in. So this is how you would use ambient occlusion, and what you could do is, in a game engine, use this texture to make it look like your object has little shadows everywhere instead of relying on real-time lighting. So this is an AO map, an ambient occlusion map. And obviously the places where the sprinkles intersect the icing, you get complete occlusion, you get pure blackness. So we're going to save this image to our hard drive. You can hit Alt-S, and it gives you the save thing, and it already has the name, Icing AO2K. So these were the textures from last time. The scratch map small is what we used for the scratches on the surface of the icing. So let's save this image. And now, in Photoshop, I'm going to open that up. Now, I'm not going to do a tutorial where, here's our icing, I use GIMP or I use some other open source tool. Maybe this would even technically be possible inside of Blender, although I find Photoshop to be the easiest, and it's what I'm familiar with. I love Blender. I love the fact that it's open source. However, I think Blender is a unicorn. I think Blender is one of the best 3D modeling programs out there, and it's open source. Meanwhile, alternatives like GIMP, I think, are sorely lacking behind things like Photoshop. I wish GIMP was as awesome as Blender is, but I just can't get into it, so forgive me for that. But I'm familiar with Photoshop. I know all the shortcut keys like I do for Blender, so I'm just going to get work done where I'm comfortable. So this is for the bottom side of the donut. You can see some sprinkles went very deep and intersected through both sides, but we don't care about the bottom side at all. So I'm just going to delete this. All right. And then with this remaining, what I want to do is isolate just the shapes of the sprinkles. And you can see right now there's a lot of grayscale and a lot of noise and stuff like that. So we're going to go up to Image, and then we'll choose Adjustments, and we'll choose Levels. And you get this little window. But if you like to use keyboard shortcuts like I do, you can hit Control-L, and you'll get there as well. And so what we're going to do is we're going to bring up the blackness to make the blackers black, and we're going to drop down the whiteness to make the grays very muted. And so now you can see we have basically just the outlines of our sprinkles without any of that shadow. There's with shadow, and there's without. And that's exactly what we want. So I'm going to hit OK. Then I'm going to go to the Magic Wand tool. You can also hit W on your keyboard to get there. And I'm going to select the white area and just hit Delete. So now we have just the sprinkles isolated by themselves. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a bump map, which we use to influence the displacement. Now, when you have a bump map, you have basically grayscale values, and the brighter the value, the higher the bump is on the surface. So we want these black areas to be like holes in the surface, but we don't want to go all the way to 1. So what I'm going to do is, with gray, I already have it set here because I did this once earlier today, but we're going to go to 127 for R, G, and B to get a nice middle value. And why 127? Well, because times 2 is 255, which is, pure white. So we want it to be halfway there. So 127 or 128, either would work. Okay, now we're going to create a new layer, and we're going to put our sprinkles on top. We're going to go to our new layer down here, and with the paint bucket tool or the fill tool, you hit G on the keyboard to get that. Put that in there, and now we have a middle value background for our sprinkles. And one thing I realized is when I did this one with the magic wand tool, I should have had continuous turned off because we have some of these islands. So I'm going to just turn off continuous and then delete those as well. Okay, now with our sprinkles, it's looking good because we have holes where we want the sprinkles to go kind of into the surface of the icing. But we also want to create that little air gap around it. So I'm going to go and moving too fast. I'm going to select this layer, go into blending options. I'm going to go into stroke, which draws an outline around it. And I'm going to set the stroke to 1. So you can see with off and with it on, it makes them a little bit thicker. Maybe that's a little bit too thick. We could choose something like this. Yeah, that's probably better. And then I'm also going to go to a color overlay and just make it pure black. And that's just in case any of like the pixels that we isolated with the levels earlier were not pure black. Now they're all pure black. So they might have been close to pure black, but now they all are. And then our stroke adds a little bit of lighter values around the edge, but that's fine. It just serves to make it a little bit thicker. But now, remember that I said, let me get out of full screen mode here. Sometimes the icing actually raises up, around where the crack is going to be. So we actually want to also add a little bit of raised area. So I'm going to, with the sprinkles area selected, go into blending options, choose outer glow, and then just make this full opacity, but bring its size way down until it looks something like this. And so this way we'll create the effect that there's a little bit of raised frosting right before the air gap, before where the sprinkle is, cut into the surface of the icing. So with those adjustments, we're now going to Control-Shift-S for Save As, and we'll use a PNG. But this is no longer AO. This is now displacement. So we'll just put displacement. And I like to use naming conventions for creating maps because it helps your files stay organized. So usually when I'm working on a big project, I'll have like the object and then its displacement or its albedo or its normal map and then the resolution. So sometimes if I'm moving it to a game engine, I can try out different resolutions and see, do I really need 4K? That's a waste of video memory, etc. So having good naming conventions is very important. So let's save our displacement map. All right. And now back in Blender, we just want to set up our nodes so that we can actually displace the surface of the frosting. And so obviously we have to be in cycles to see displacement happening. And I'm going to temporarily hide the sprinkles because we want to see just the displacement effect for now. Now this image that we used, and we don't even need this anymore really, I'm going to hide this. And then let's see, join. Okay. And then we can bring our camera and light back just because we want to see the effects nicely. And then like I told you guys in the last tutorial, if you hit 0 on the number pad, you'll get the focus from the camera. But then we can hit Control B and isolate out just the section to render so we don't have to see the whole thing, right? Okay, so now this texture is where we have the icing AO2K. That's what we baked in the previous step. What we can just do is reuse this node and instead open our displacement map that we just created. And if you want to see thumbnails, you can click up there and make sure that that is the displacement map. All right, so we have that, and previously we have this displacement node, and it is using, if I use node wrangler, control shift click this node, it looks like this. And so we want to keep this scratch map, but we want to mix in this. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first thing is we want to probably be able to control the strength of this displacement map. So I'm going to go and create a converter, a math node, just put this in stream here, set it to multiply. And I'm just going to leave it at 1 for now. We could adjust it later if we need to. And then we're also going to put a multiply on this one as well. I'll just shift D on this node and drop it in line there. And I found from previous experimenting that that looks good at 0.5. I'm going to move all this stuff over here so we have more room. All right, and then what we want to do is combine these two. So this one is what we had before. This one is what we just generated. We want to combine them. And so I'm going to create a color mix RGB. And the mix mode, I'm going to switch to linear light because I found that that had the best results. We're going to set this up to be 1. And then we're going to take this value and actually drop it in there. Also, before I forget, this displacement map should be set to non-color data. Or color data, as Blender Guru says, because we're using it just for the grayscale values, so we don't want the gamma curve to be applied to that. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. But basically, in a nutshell, the RGB values we use to see on like Photoshop or on our monitors have a curve applied to them to adapt to human eyes. But when you're doing physics calculations with light, you don't want that curve applied to things other than color. And since in this case we're just using it for height, we wouldn't want to have an adaptive curve applied to that image file. All right, so now we have this combination where we see the scratches, but we also have these cutouts for the sprinkles, and they're slightly brighter around the edge. So we are really close to being done here. So yeah, let's just, with node wrangler enabled, and by the way, in case you've missed it, in preferences, there is a great add-on on the add-ons tab called Node Wrangler, or not Wrangler, Node Wrangler. Wrangler, that's a new word. Node Wrangler, which allows you to basically hold Control and Shift and see the output of any node, so you can quickly preview what's going on in your nodes. So when I hit Control Shift click on this, you can now see we have dents for where the icing should go, for where the sprinkles should go, and raised edges around them. We still have the scratches like before, so that's working really nicely. So now let's just bring in our icing again. I keep saying icing, I mean sprinkles. And there you go. You can see it's oh, you know what? Nope, there's one other thing we need to do. Two other things, actually, because we need to also make it physically deform this material. So we're going to go into material settings, scroll down, and switch from bump only to bump and displacement. And now we probably want a little bit more mesh data to work with here. So I'm just going to go to modifiers and add in a subdivision surface and move that to the top. So let's see what we look like when we zoom in here now. And that's looking pretty good. You can see how it looks like there's a little bit of a gap around the bottom of the sprinkles where they meet the frosting. You can see like this one really looks like it's starting to get buried there. You can see in many cases the frosting looks like it's pushed up a little bit and rising around the sprinkles. You can see it's almost like casting a shadow on the part of the sprinkle where it's been buried and it's been pushed up. Look at this. This whole little edge right here looks like it's been pushed and displaced out of the way. And then there's like a little tiny bit of an air gap around the sprinkle. So look at that. Perfect. Right underneath this one, you can see it's like the frosting is separated away, but it's also rising a little bit at the same time. All right, there's actually one more thing that I want to do. Let me zoom in here real quick again and do another border render just so we can speed up our render times. I just want to render a small part of the scene here. One thing is, like, if you look at my example image, they do seem to be buried a little bit deeper than what we got. And that's because I probably, should have played with the displacement node. So if we select our icing, the displacement is currently tiny. It's 0.03. And if we just take that down to like 0.01, we should now get a much more dramatic effect, which is kind of what we were going for, and that's what it looks like in the preview image I had here rendered previously. So now we can see that this looks much more dramatically buried, and the frosting does seem to rise up more dramatically around the edges of the sprinkles. And of course, this might be too extreme for you. If you find that the extrusion or the displacement is a little bit too jaggy, we can always bump up how many subdivisions we have on the icing. Obviously, that'll be more expensive, but it will smooth some of those things out. So obviously, play with the values, come up with what you find works well for you. If you think that this is a little bit too aggressive, I did end up using 0.001 on my final render. But if you think that's a little bit, aggressive, let's, knock it down by half and see what that looks like, for instance. So I just wanted to mention that before we wrap up is, we forgot to play with the scale, and that does make a difference to how the final render ends up looking like. And this is actually looking pretty good right here. So that's interesting. So it's technically 0.005, but the view is rounding to 0.001. But I can tell that it doesn't look as strong as when we had it actually dialed in. So that's interesting that Blender is showing you a rounded value here, but internally it's using a different value. But yeah, so something like, play with what makes sense for you. I feel like maybe in this render I might have been a little bit aggressive. I'm looking at my original file, I definitely used 0.001 for that displacement. But you'll end up with jaggies because it's only as good as the resolution of your AO map or your displacement map, and it's also only good as the resolution of your subdivision. So if you don't want that to be as pronounced, you could make it a subtler value here. But play with the values and see what you get, So to recap, to get this effect where, it looks like they're buried into the icing, all we really did is generate, let me open up the other file real quick, icing AO. Because it's, close this one. So we generated an ambient occlusion map, which told us where the sprinkles were. And we used Photoshop to do a little bit of processing on that so that we could have a bump map which would be more believable by basically putting a middle gray for everything else, then making the sprinkles be pure black, and then giving them a little bit of glow to make it look like the frosting was raised around the sprinkles. And then in Blender, just like we used for the cake donut, and I'm actually going to clear my render box with Control-Alt-B, and I'm going to bring back my donut, and I can bring back the environment, and I think we're good. So just like we used generated displacement for the bumps on the cake donut, and we had to go to that material and choose displacement and bump, and we had to make sure that it was, significantly subdivided. We're basically doing the exact same thing except on the frosting, but instead of the cake where we used noise textures to do the displacement, we're just using an image texture, and the image texture happens to be custom tailored to the positions of our sprinkles. And so that does it for this tutorial. Last time I showed you guys how to fix intersecting sprinkles, and this time I showed you how to make them look like they're truly embedded into the icing that they lay on top of. Like I said, this will probably be my last donut-related thing, but coming up in the next few days, I have a Lego tutorial that I want to tackle. And so yeah, be sure to look out for that. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And let's see some nice intersecting frosting sprinkles on r/blender.